Hi and welcome. I'm Steve Mulberry, a geospatial strategist here at GISinc.
Hi, I'm Kelly Bigley. I'm a geospatial developer at GISinc.
And today we are going to talk about web development, specifically in the ArcGIS world. And we're going to start off at that sort of 101 level and walk through the processes to getting started developing web applications in the ArcGIS system. And so, Kelly, I thought it'd be fun to kind of walk through the different components that are needed to make this happen. And obviously, the very first thing we need to have is some kind of spatial library. Talk to me about what this spatial library is.
Sure. So a spatial library is going to give us an ability to put a map in an application. It's going to give us an ability to work with individual layers or do some kind of analysis. And this library is going to be one of many that are available. There's going to be Mapbox, there's Esri Leaflet, and of course there's the Esri JavaScript API 4.x. For our purposes, we're going to go with Esri because it has the kitchen sink.
Awesome. All right. So we got settled in on the JavaScript API, and it's currently at what, version 4 dot whatever, 4.x world, correct?
Correct.
All right,
Correct.
great.
It has all sorts of new for our 3D technology, and so we're going to set ourselves up for success.
Awesome. Okay, so we got the spatial library in play. Now, the next thing that comes into mind is some kind of framework. We got to put this JavaScript in a framework to help us in our development environment. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So the JavaScript frameworks that are out there make it easy for us as web developers to scale applications as more functionality is needed, more requirements, etc. And it gives us an ability to separate our code out into proper areas of concern. It gives us an opportunity to compile our code into vanilla JavaScript, even though we want to write in more complicated syntax. It's easier for us as developers to work in. So the common ones these days, React was written by Facebook, and that's a very common framework. Then there's Angular IO, which is written by Google, and it's their second iteration to a framework. And there are others, Vue.js, etc. We are going to focus on Angular IO because, again, it kind of has everything, including the kitchen sink, just like Esri's JavaScript API.
So I remember back in the day, Dojo was sort of the framework, right, of choice early on. Is that still an option?
It definitely is still an option. Dojo also, like Angular, does have the kitchen sink, but it doesn't have quite as nice of a developer experience as some of the newer frameworks like Angular and React. So we're going to take advantage of the fact that Esri's new 4x API it really is agnostic. It doesn't care which framework you want to use. Previously, it worked best if you used Dojo, but you could play with whatever you wanted. And the new 4x environment gives us much easier ability to use whatever framework we want.
Excellent. Okay, so I'm sort of seeing a trend here. We got our spatial library, we got this framework. Now we need some kind of methodology. I know back in my day when I started developing, I just opened up a text editor and I just did the Big Bang Theory and just started writing code. So talk to us about the methodology that we should implement as developers.
Sure. So there is a big emphasis on separation of concerns when you're writing code. So when you have sections of your code that is displaying certain things, that is typically a view or some kind of template that is encompassing just what we're seeing. And then we have some more back-end core logic that's integrating with perhaps back-end services or querying data and whatnot, and that's more functional behind-the-scenes code. And then you have that code that's sort of in between that marries what we see on the screen and that behind-the-scenes functional code. And so that's common. You might have heard of that as MVVM, model, view model. You might have heard MVC, model, view, controller. And these JavaScript frameworks have similar methodologies. As a matter of fact, These new ones are very component-based. It's a kind of a different term, but still the same concept as we're separating our code into modules, components, and services. At least that's how the Angular framework implements its code and its separation of concerns. So because we're using Angular, will follow that module, component, and services approach.
Excellent. Okay, sounds great. So now, again, referring back to old school here, I would open up a text editor and start doing this. Can you use a text editor these days, or what should we be looking at from an integrated development environment standpoint?
You totally can use a text editor, but we like to take advantage of context-sensitive help. So as you're starting to type in your code, the nice IDEs will kind of give you suggestions of what the next, what it thinks you're probably going to be wanting to add. And there's a lot of text-like editors. Sublime was a very common one 10 years ago. There's also WebStorm was popular maybe 5 or 6 years ago, maybe still popular for some, but these days Visual Studio Code is a free download from Microsoft that gives a really fantastic developer experience. It's probably one of the most thorough that I've seen, especially as a free available software. There's a lot of different extensions that you can install, plugins that provide a wealth of other options in addition to the out-of-the-box support that it provides. So it's a really fantastic environment, and it's kind of taken over the web development world, at least for those front-end developers. So we're going to use Visual Studio Code as well.
Awesome, great. Okay, so we've established our spatial library, the framework, the methodology, the IDE. Now walk us through what you're about to sort of guide us through this whole process, the steps that we're going to take here.
Sure. So we're going to start on the developer's website at ArcGIS. And then we're going to go into the Angular tutorial just for following a quick setup. We're going to install some dependencies that we'll need. We're going to create a new Angular app. We're going to then follow loosely one of the tutorials in the developer's site at ArcGIS and follow some of the steps in that tutorial to add HTML, reference the API, get an API key, create a map and map view, and we're going to do it all in an Angular approach, differently from what we'll see in the tutorial on the developer site. But at the end, voila, we will be cooking with gas.
Okay, so let's start off by going to the developers.arcgis.com site. Okay, so here we are at the it's simple, developers.arcgis.com site. This is the user experience. This is where you get access to the documentation, the features, the price. A really nice pricing calculator there to help developers understand the pay-as-you-go model. So if you're using base maps or geo enrichments or services, demographic data, all that's available there. Some nice help for learning how to build it, building and deploying, and then innovating with the technology. But I'm going to focus in on the documentations here real quick. You can see lots of options here for learning about the different APIs that are available to you. I'm not going to go into all these here. We're going to focus in on what Kelly is going to show us. So I'm going to jump right in here to the mapping APIs and the location services. This will give us a good understanding of how to get started, the different tutorials, services that are available to us, the maps and data and visualization, all these capabilities you can see over here on the left as we talk through these. And I'm going to start off, I'm going to go to the tutorials here, and the very first one, I think in the list here, is going to be display map. So this is the one that Kelly mentioned, and this is the one that she's going to walk us through, so I'll click on that one. And you'll notice that each one of these tutorials and help documents are going to give us not only access to the APIs itself, it'll show us how to use Leaflet or Mapbox or Open Layers. We're going to focus again on the JavaScript API. Once I get in there a little bit deeper, it'll actually show me a running application. So the result of whatever capability that I'm after, so I can navigate and use that sample. But I can also scroll down and look at the actual code that's being used to fulfill that request. In this case, a map. Now, Kelly, I have to admit, this code right here looks like, my old school days where I would copy and paste and put that in a text document and I'd be done. But I don't think that follows your process of putting this into this methodology and things like that. Is that a fair statement?
That's definitely fair. These samples that Esri provides are fantastic to kind of get you going, get you playing around, but it certainly doesn't show off what the professional developer is going to incorporate as a full solution. And so that's what we really want to show off today is how do you take these really simple samples and actually incorporate it into something full-blown, using a framework, using the appropriate methodologies, etc. So that's what we're up to.
Excellent. Okay. So if we go back to your steps, so now you're going to take us from step 2 through step 10 there and get us going, right?
Absolutely. Yep. And this scary screen here of code is where we're headed.
Awesome. Yeah, this looks a lot different from just those 10 lines of code on the last page. So I'm excited to kind of see where this ends up.
So here we have the display a map demo running in an Angular application. So let's check it out. So here we have a lot of words on the screen, and what we have is the few files that we had to change in our out-of-the-box canned Angular app that I built with a tutorial. So let's figure out how we get here from scratch. So let's start over and go to the Angular tutorial and start from scratch. So here we are on the Angular IO website looking at the setup tutorial for a basic application. So first things first, I had to have Node.js installed, and fortunately there's a nice link here. If you don't have it, you can go and download it and install it. Pretty straightforward. The other thing is that coming with the Node.js installation will be your NPM or your Node package manager, which we'll use to install the Angular command line interface, which will give us access to build a new app from the command line. So now we're in Visual Studio Code, and we will open our command prompt, and we will install the Angular CLI with NPM. And since we now have the Angular CLI, we can use the command ng-new to create a new demo app. And no, we don't want strict mode. And yeah, let's do some routing, and let's just pick a style sheet of SCSS. Those details we'll get into in a future video. But for now, let's see what is happening when it builds this demo app. It has stubbed out a ton of scaffolded code for us, and that makes it super nice. So let's change our directory into this demo app, and let's run the app using the ng-serve command, not any serve. This will actually compile the code, not in the traditional sense of compiling, but in the more loosely defined sense of compiling. It's pulling all the code together, stripping out all of the TypeScript specifics, and outputting it into a vanilla JavaScript solution. And so this is the out-of-the-box demo app from the Angular IO setup tutorial. So what we're going to do now is rip out that information that was in the built-in Angular solution, and we're going to dump in our demo displaying a map. So this app component HTML that is incorporated in the scaffolded code is actually where all of the guts of that out-of-the-box app lives. And you can see in the comments that this is just placeholder code, and so we can rip it out. And that's exactly what we're going to do. And so now this is where we're going to put in that HTML that we saw in the Esri display a map sample or tutorial. So we're going to put in that HTML here. There was some styling that needed to be changed as part of the display a map tutorial. The HTML and body tag styling we need to put in the styles.scss of the root source in the output scaffolded code. The app component.scss is where we're going to tie the styles directly to the app and the map CSS classes that we've built as part of our HTML markup. So this is the same code that we saw in the sample code or the tutorial from the display a map, but we're putting it into some very specific places within the Angular scaffolded code. And so, voila, it automatically updated and the old Angular stuff is gone, but we don't see a map yet. So in order for that to happen, we got to follow the next steps in the display a map sample. So the next step is to reference the API. And this is how the sample recommends that you do it. And we're not going to follow this exactly. We're going to use a more modern approach. So first we're going to stop our web server that was running the application. And we're going to install the 4x JavaScript API using that ArcGIS core library that we just installed. And so what it did is it actually modifies our package.json and adds in our reference as a dependency. So that'll be useful for future developers to pull down this repository later and be able to install whatever dependencies are needed. So this angular.json file is actually part of Angular's build system. It's part of what defines what happens when it, quote, compiles the code. And we have to add in a reference to the Esri items as assets so that when the Angular build and compilation step executes, that it will grab the Esri dependencies and incorporate them in the output. And we're going to do the same thing not only for the build, but also for the test step. And again, we'll get into the testing steps in a future video. So I'm just going to copy some bits. So we have both the same additions in the build step as well as the test step of our Angular JSON. And so these are the key pieces that correlate to that reference the API step in the display a map tutorial. So now let's serve up the application again, which again is compiling and building a consolidated output of code. And now we're going to reference the modules for our map and our map view. And we're going to do that inside the app component.ts file. And we're going to do that a little bit differently from how it's mentioned in the tutorial. We're going to use the ES module approach and import the information or the specific modules by using import statements rather than require statement, which is what the demo here shows. So before we can move on, we have to create an API key. And so we saw this developer's dashboard a little bit earlier, and here's where we're actually going to create an API key. And so I'm just going to create this demo app API key to associate it with our application. And what we see here is the actual key that we can copy. There's also a fair amount of things that we can modify about access, referrers, etc. to utilize this API key. But for now, we're just going to copy it and head back into our code so that we can continue with the demo. So in the sample code, the create a map step talks about adding in the API key, creating a map, and then there's the create a map view step where we actually incorporate it into the map view. So we're going to kind of combine both of those steps into one here. So we're going to add two new properties to our component called a map and a map view, and they are of type map and type map view. And that's Angular specific properties on our component. And we're going to reference the ID of the div tag, just like the rest of the sample shows. So we now have our map and our map view instantiated on the initialization step of the component in our Angular app. And voila, we now have the exact same demo, that display a map demo, but bundled in our Angular application. And to kind of head back to where we got, how did we get to this point? So we had a few files that we had to modify. We had the app component HTML, the app component TypeScript. We had the styles for the overall app, and then we have the styles for the component. And then we had to modify the angular.json, which configured the build system for the dependencies. And that's it.
Wow, thanks, Kelly. That was definitely an in-depth look at, sort of start to finish, taking the spatial library, the framework, the methodology, the IDE, bringing it all together for us. Really impressed there. To me, this really sets the foundation for doing a comprehensive development and really tailoring solutions, correct?
That's correct. Gone are the days of a single HTML file with everything that you need. Now we have a full solution. We have a full stack that really gives us that ability to extend and extend and extend. And don't let it scare you. It's not that bad. We're going to continue to walk you through additional steps as we add more functionality.
Great, perfect. And we know at GISinc, we know you can do a lot out of the box with the configurable solutions that ArcGIS System has to offer both online and on-premise. And we definitely start with that approach. But if there's a need for extending or enhancing some of those solutions, or even tailoring a custom workflow for your specific organization's needs, we understand the process. We have folks like Kelly that can definitely help you get over that hump, that hurdle, and get into this process. So, and if you have any questions and you want to reach out to us, please email Kelly or myself, and we'd be happy to share our insights and or talk to you further about developing web applications in the ArcGIS system. Thanks again.
Bye.